The shot came from the wrong direction. Staff Sergeant Emily Carter heard the crack split the desert air. Sharp, controlled, professional. And in the half-second before the civilian truck erupted into flame near Checkpoint Delta, her body was already turning, scope swinging not toward the border, but away from it, into the city. A second shot, flat trajectory. A Border Patrol officer dropped at the customs gate, and the crowd scattered like startled birds. Emily's crosshairs swept rooftops. Empty, dust, wind. No, someone's here. Her radio hissed static. Then a round punched the concrete parapet 6 inches from her rifle barrel. A precise, deliberate miss. Not a warning, an introduction. He already knows exactly where I am. The bus from Fort Bliss dropped Emily Carter at the edge of a city that couldn't decide if it was dying or already dead. Cuervo Junction. Population 11,000, according to the rusted sign outside the Chevron station. Half that number remained. The rest had packed whatever fit in a pickup truck and driven north, away from the checkpoints, away from the rumors, away from the kind of silence that settles over a town when everyone with good instincts has already left. Emily stood on the cracked shoulder of Highway 10 and studied the skyline. It wasn't much of a skyline, a grain elevator, a water tower with Cuervo stenciled in faded blue paint, 3-story commercial blocks lining the main drag, half their windows boarded, a customs processing warehouse the size of an aircraft hangar, surrounded by chain link and razor wire. And beyond all of it, 200 meters south, the checkpoint itself, concrete barriers, floodlight towers, a bilateral crossing that had processed 17,000 vehicles a day before the situation deteriorated. Now it processed maybe 300. The rest had rerouted, or stopped moving entirely. "You're Carter." She turned. A man leaned against a government-issue Ford F-250, arms folded, watching her with the unhurried patience of someone who'd spent decades waiting in places far worse than this. He was lean, weathered to the color of old saddle leather, wearing civilian clothes, khaki pants, a plain gray shirt, a battered ball cap with no insignia. His eyes were the flat, steady gray of gunmetal. "Master Sergeant Holloway?" she asked. "Just Holloway." He didn't extend a hand. His gaze moved past her to the tree line, then the rooftops, then back to her. A complete threat assessment in under 4 seconds. "You eat on the bus?" "No, sir." "Stop calling me sir. I work for a living." He pushed off the truck. "Come on. I'll brief you while you choke down something that used to be a sandwich." The forward operating base, if you could call it that, was a converted motel on the north end of Cuervo Junction's Main Street. 3 rooms had been stripped of furniture and given over to equipment. A 4th served as the TOC with 2 laptops, a satellite uplink, and a laminated map of the border zone pinned to the wall with thumbtacks. A 5th room contained 2 cots. Emily dropped her kit bag and stood in front of the map. "Routine Overwatch," she said. Not a question, a recitation of her briefing packet. "That's what it says." Holloway set a paper plate on the equipment table. Turkey sandwich, warm, slightly compressed. He poured 2 cups of black coffee from a thermos. "Command wants eyes on the checkpoint corridor. 3 weeks of elevated cartel activity. 2 incidents involving cross-border fire. Standard recon package. You observe, you report, you don't escalate." Emily studied the map, the checkpoint, the highway corridor, the city spreading north from the border like a cracked fan. "And you're here because—" "Contract advisor. I've worked this border twice before." He paused. His jaw worked slightly, like he was considering how much to say. "3rd time, they gave me a partner." She looked at him. "You any good?" he asked. "Army says yes." "Army says a lot of things." He sat down on a folding chair, cradling his coffee. His eyes went to the map. "Pull your chair over. I'll tell you what Army didn't put in your packet. She pulled the chair over. This city's been deteriorating for 8 months, Holloway said. Started slow, checkpoint traffic rerouted. Then some of the local businesses closed up. Then families started leaving. Nobody announced anything, it just happened. He tapped the customs warehouse on the map. 2 weeks ago, a federal liaison officer named Garza filed a report saying the rerouting patterns didn't match cartel activity profiles. Said it looked more like coordinated infrastructure pressure. He paused. 3 days later, Garza was reassigned. Report was classified. Emily kept her face neutral. You have a copy? Holloway smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. Get some sleep, Carter. We start at 0400. The Paloma Hotel had been closed for 6 years. 11 stories of sun-bleached concrete, its ground floor windows boarded, its lobby dark and smelling of old carpet and rat droppings, its elevator frozen somewhere between the 4th and 5th floors. But its roof, accessible via a fire stairwell that creaked under Emily's boots with theatrical persistence, offered an unobstructed 360-degree view of Cuervo Junction and everything south of it. Emily spent 40 minutes on the roof before she touched her rifle. That was the discipline Holloway had drilled into her during their first morning together, 3 years earlier at a training cadre in Arizona. You don't shoot a position you don't own, and you don't own a position you haven't mapped. So she mapped it. She moved the perimeter in a slow clockwise circuit, crouching at intervals, noting every reflective surface, every wind channel, every sightline. The desert sun was already working hard at 0530, throwing flat light across rooftops that cast shadow pools in useful places. She noted a broken water tower on the building directly east, a potential secondary sniper nest. She noted that the gap between the grain elevator and the customs warehouse created a natural wind corridor running roughly north-northeast, consistent with the prevailing desert breeze. She noted that 3 buildings on the south side of the main drag had rooftop access ladders that would be invisible from street level. She noted other things too. Position prep marks on the northwest corner parapet, subtle. A civilian wouldn't see them. But Emily had spent 4 years learning to read rooftops like text, and what she read here was, someone was here before you. The marks were 3 or 4 days old. A shallow scrape where a bipod had been set. A small clearance of gravel along the parapet edge. Someone had swept a stable platform. And tucked against the corner, barely visible under a loose piece of flashing, a single piece of military-grade brass. 7.62 by 51 millimeter NATO. She bagged the brass without disturbing the surrounding area. Then she set up her own position. Her rifle was AM-110 semi-automatic sniper system, configured for urban work, suppressed, ACOG plus backup iron sights, with a Leupold scope for primary observation. She settled in behind it and began her first sector scan. Checkpoint Delta, 12 Border Patrol personnel, 2 K9 units, 1 armored vehicle parked at the far end of the approach lane. Civilian traffic moving in a thin trickle. A white pickup, a panel van with commercial markings, a sedan with Mexican plates. Routine, bureaucratic. Customs warehouse, closed, padlocked main gate. But the loading dock on the south side had fresh tire tracks. Someone had been in and out recently. Highway corridor, the northbound lane was empty past the halfway mark. No traffic at all on the bridge section. That was unusual for this time of morning. Even in a city this depleted, commuters and supply trucks should be moving by now. Emily logged each observation in her field notebook. Then she began mapping the wind. Desert-urban environments were deceptive. The heat differentials between building surfaces and open pavement created microcurrents that defied simple direction readings. She watched the dust. She watched the way it moved in the gap between 2 buildings to the southeast. Not straight, but in a lazy spiral, clockwise, suggesting a back pressure eddy from the prevailing northerly flow. She adjusted her mental ballistic table accordingly. At 0640, Holloway's voice came through her earpiece. "Talk to me. Position established, 360 mapped. I've got eyes on the checkpoint and the corridor." She paused. "Someone was on this roof in the last 72 hours. Military brass, 7.62 NATO. Bipod marks on the northwest parapet." A long silence from Holloway. "Keep it. Already bagged." "How's the wind?" "Complicated." She watched a dust devil form and dissolve between two commercial buildings. "There's a canyon effect running east of the grain elevator. Anything firing from the south side of the street would have to compensate for a consistent left-to-right drift on the final 100 meters before the checkpoint." "That's useful to know," Holloway said. "Is it?" He didn't answer that. It happened at 0917. Emily was running her third sector scan of the morning, methodical, unhurried, moving from the checkpoint to the highway to the warehouse and back in a steady clockwise pattern. The city was quiet. A dog barked somewhere in the residential blocks to the north. A bird, some kind of desert hawk, rode a thermal above the grain elevator. The shot was a single, clean crack. Flat, fast, and professional. Not the booming report of a long-range competition rifle. This was a working weapon, tuned for controlled sound signature, fired from an enclosed or partially enclosed position. The civilian truck was a white Ford F350, commercial plates, moving toward the checkpoint with a cargo of what appeared to be bottled water on a pallet in the bed. The round hit the engine block. The truck rolled to a stop and then, 2 seconds later, something in the fuel system ignited, and the cab went up in a fast orange bloom of fire. Emily was already moving her scope. Where did that come from? Command's immediate radio traffic said cartel, said south side. The trajectory from a cartel-controlled position south of the border would have come from roughly the 2 o'clock angle relative to the truck's position. A shallow descending line from the ridgeline over the river. But Emily had been watching the checkpoint. She'd watched the truck approach. She'd seen the impact. And the impact had punched the engine block from the left side. The truck's left, which was north, which was into the city, at a slightly upward angle, not descending. Someone had shot from inside Cuervo Junction. She forced herself not to key the radio immediately. She held position and scanned. North side of the main drag, upper floors. The light was tricky now, sun getting higher, washing out shadow detail. She swept methodically. Commercial block, hardware store, boarded. Insurance office, boarded. Cantina, shuttered. Hotel, not the Paloma, a smaller one, 3 stories, brick facade, south-facing windows. 3rd floor, 2nd window from the left. The window was open, or rather had been opened recently. She could see the slight displacement of the interior curtain where it had been pushed aside and not replaced with care. She held the scope there for 30 seconds. Nothing moved. But nothing would it? Not if the shooter was good. She logged the bearing in her notebook. 247 degrees from her position, distance approximately 310 meters, and keyed her radio. Overwatch to base. I have a bearing discrepancy on the impact vector for the truck incident. Request you log this and hold before any counterfire authorization. Static. Then Lieutenant Morales from the checkpoint, TOC. Overwatch, be advised. This is being treated as a cartel engagement from the south. Hold your position. Emily kept her scope on the 3rd floor window. Understood. Logging impact vector northwest of the checkpoint at 247 degrees. Shot came from inside the city. Another pause. Overwatch, confirm you are not observing active shooter. Confirming no active shooter currently visible. But the physics don't support a southern origin, Lieutenant. A longer pause. Noted. Stand by. She stood by. The window didn't move. Holloway noticed the pattern first. Walk the eastern grid again, he said over the radio. The residential blocks between the warehouse and the school. Tell me what you see. Emily shifted her scope east. The residential grid was a series of parallel streets running north-south, lined with single-story adobe houses, most with curtains drawn. At first glance, empty, quiet, a city exhaling, but motion. She took her time with it, didn't rush the observation. Let her eyes settle and find what was actually there rather than what she expected. 3 people on foot, civilians, older, a woman in a blue dress, a man with a walking stick, another man pushing a cart, moving away from the checkpoint, which was normal. But they were moving at an angle that didn't line up with any of the northbound streets. They were cutting diagonally, northwest, toward an area of the city that had no visible destination. No bus stop, no market, no shelter she could identify on the map. A pickup truck, tan, no plates, idled in a side street for 11 minutes, then moved north without ever going near the checkpoint. 3 young men on foot followed it on parallel routes, 50 meters spacing, coordinated. A border patrol vehicle that normally ran the checkpoint perimeter at regular intervals had varied its route 3 times this morning, adding a long southern detour that brought it near the warehouse loading dock. None of these things were individually alarming. Together, they formed a picture that Emily's instinct read as deliberate. "Someone's moving people," she said. "Or moving them out of the way," Holloway replied. "What's the warehouse loading dock showing?" "Fresh tire tracks. Gate padlock, but the padlock looks new. Original chain's been cut." She heard him exhale slowly. "You see anything to the northwest of the highway bridge? Dead ground between the bridge and the feed store?" She swung her scope. It took 30 seconds to find the right angle. The dead ground was exactly what the name described. A shallow depression in terrain invisible from street level. But from 11 stories up, with the right angle, she could see into it. 2 vehicles, dark SUVs, parked with their noses pointed toward the highway. Confirmed, 2 dark vehicles, SUVs, parked in the low ground northwest of the bridge. No visible occupants from this angle. How long have they been there? She thought back. At least since I established position. I clocked that area at 0550 and noted nothing unusual. So either I missed them, possible, pre-dawn, or they moved in before first light. Holloway's voice was quiet when he replied, "That's a blocking position, Carter." She didn't answer because he was right, and they both knew it. Holloway came up to the Paloma roof at 1100. He moved well for his age, quiet on the stairs, controlled on the gravel, settling beside her position without disturbing the surrounding area in any of the ways that announced a careless presence. He'd been in sniper work long enough that moving silently was less a trained behavior than a settled habit. He didn't look through her scope. He looked at the city with his naked eye for a long moment, the way a man looks at something he's seen before and doesn't like seeing again. "Talk to me about the brass," he said. 7.62 NATO. Standard, not match grade. Federal premium head stamp. 3 to 4 days old based on oxidation. She paused. But positioned. Not ejected randomly. It was on the outside of the parapet, not the inside. Whoever it was, they cleared their brass and missed one. Or left one. Why would someone leave a piece of brass? Holloway was quiet for a moment. Because they wanted whoever came next to know they'd been there. He finally looked at her. "That's a message, Carter, not an accident." Emily considered this. Who knew we were coming? Command, logistics, the checkpoint CO. He let that sit. Maybe nobody. Maybe somebody. He pulled a water bottle from his jacket pocket, drank, put it back. You know what a false flag operation looks like on the ground? Not in the history books, not in the after-action reviews. On the ground, in real time, from a sniper position? Tell me. It doesn't look like anything, that's the point. His voice was completely level, informational, almost detached, the way a man describes a weather system rather than a catastrophe. Everything looks like something else. The wrong shot looks like cartel activity. The civilian movement looks like panic. The blocking position looks like a routine vehicle. He glanced toward the highway bridge. What it actually looks like, what the whole thing looks like, is a city that's about to be used. Used for what? To start something. He looked at her again. Kid, you understand what I'm telling you. If something smells like a setup, it's usually worse than that. She held his gaze. You think someone is engineering an incident here. I think Garza's report got buried for a reason. He stood, brushing gravel from his pants. I think the rerouting patterns, the blocking positions, the very specific timing of that truck shot, it's a prep sequence. Someone is setting the board. He paused with his hand on the stairwell door. Keep logging everything. Exact bearings, exact times, exact descriptions. Paper notebook, not digital. Whatever happens here, the log stays. Holloway, he looked back. The shot that hit near my position this morning, she said. Command wrote it up as stray fire. His expression didn't change, but his eyes did. Something shifted in the gunmetal gray, a deepening. I know. Stray fire doesn't come from 300 meters and miss by 6 inches. No, he said, it doesn't. He went through the door and down the stairs without another word. The second killing happened at 1422. Senior Border Patrol agent Dennis Ruiz was walking the checkpoint's east perimeter, a route he ran 3 times per shift. Same path, same pace, same timing. Emily had logged him twice already that morning and noted the regularity as both a personal habit and a tactical vulnerability. You didn't run the same route at the same pace. That was basic. But Ruiz ran it anyway, because Cuervo Junction was supposed to be a routine posting, and routine postings made people into creatures of habit. The shot came from the south, or so it would appear. Emily heard the report a fraction of a second after she saw Ruiz drop. A single, clean impact to the upper torso, dead center, not the ragged wound of a tumbling round, but the tight, punched-in wound pattern of a stable, high-velocity projectile. He was dead before he hit the concrete. The radio exploded. Shooter! Shooter south of the checkpoint! All units, active shooter, south of the wire. Return fire authorized, south sector. Emily was already working the problem. She'd had her scope on the south ridgeline for the past 3 hours. Partial cloud cover was limiting her, but she'd been building a picture. Rock formations, shrub lines, 3 potential hide positions that a competent sniper might use. None of them had shown any activity all morning. No heat shimmer from a barrel, no dust displacement, no scope glint. But Ruiz was dead, and the round had, she estimated from the impact angle, the way his body had spun slightly left, entered from the east-southeast. She swung her scope east. The Brick Hotel. 3rd floor, 2nd window from left. The curtain moved. Not from wind. It moved with the controlled, precise motion of someone pulling it back into place from inside. Overwatch to command. Her voice was flat, controlled. I am observing activity consistent with shooter position at the 3-story Brick Hotel, east side of main drag, 3rd floor, 2nd window from left. Bearing from my position is 247, range approximately 310 meters. This is the same building I flagged this morning. Overwatch command. All units are reporting fire from the south. Are you sure? Emily watched the window. Certain. The impact vector on Agent Ruiz is east-southeast, not south. The wound entry is in the right chest, not the left chest. A shot from the south ridgeline would have hit his left side. She took a breath. Whoever shot him is inside this city. Dead air on the radio for several seconds, then, Overwatch, stand by. She stood by. The window did not move again. Below at the checkpoint, she watched the response unfold. Personnel taking cover, the armored vehicle moving, 2 patrol trucks accelerating toward the south fence, all responding to a threat that wasn't there. Whoever was in that hotel room was watching the same thing she was watching, and they knew it was working. The pattern became clear to Emily in the hour between 1500 and 1600, while Command argued on encrypted channels she could partially decode, and the checkpoint below slowly militarized in response to a phantom threat. She'd been building a list in her notebook. Shot 1, 0917, civilian truck, engine block, northwest entry angle. Official report, cartel, south. Actual, inside city, from the east. Shot 2, 1422, Agent Ruiz, upper torso, east-southeast entry angle. Official report, active shooter, south sector. Actual, same hotel position, east. She stared at the list. Both shots had been attributed to the south. Both shots had actually come from inside the city. Neither shot had come from the same position. Shot 1 was from a higher angle, suggesting an upper floor. Shot 2 was from the third floor, lower angle. The shooter was moving between positions. But there was something else, something about the targets. The truck had been civilian, a commercial delivery, low profile, the kind of vehicle that would create a fire, a scene, a news image. The kind of target that read as cartel intimidation. Ruiz had been Border Patrol, a uniformed federal officer. The kind of target that read as an attack on American law enforcement, an escalation. Both shots had been designed to tell a story, and the story they told was, the cartel is attacking across the border. But there was a third element. She flipped back through her morning notes. The civilian movement she'd flagged with Holloway, the diagonal foot traffic, the coordinated men, the tan pickup. She'd been thinking of it as preparation. Now she read it differently. Clearing the field. Someone had been methodically moving civilians out of specific zones. Not randomly, specifically. The zones that corresponded to where the shooting would happen, where the response would happen, where the escalation would concentrate. They weren't just planning to fire shots, they were planning to control the aftermath. Emily set her notebook down and looked at the city. 3 checkpoints in the corridor. 1,800 meters of exposed crossing infrastructure. A city already half evacuated, its civilian population thinned to the point where a major incident would have minimal collateral witness coverage. Command fully committed to a false threat vector to the south. And a sniper inside the city who was moving freely between positions, firing precisely enough to kill without panic, placing shots that told an exact story. She thought about the brass on the Paloma roof, the message Holloway had described. Whoever came next. She was the sniper on Overwatch. She was the one with eyes on the city. She was the one who had flagged both impact vectors correctly and been told to stand by, twice. If she could see what was happening, if she was beginning to understand the shape of it, then the person doing it knew she was here, knew she was watching, and had chosen to let her watch. Why? She looked at the Paloma's northwest parapet, thought about a single piece of brass, placed not randomly but deliberately, a professional signature. Because they want me to understand what I'm looking at, because they want a witness, or, and this thought arrived with a cold, deliberate weight, because they want to make sure the only witness is isolated up here when everything starts. She keyed the radio. Overwatch to Holloway, need your eyes on the command channel traffic. Something is wrong with the whole pattern here. Static. She tried again. Holloway, come back. Nothing. Outside on the highway bridge, a military vehicle she didn't recognize had taken a position at the northern approach. It hadn't been there an hour ago, and its markings, she brought her scope to bear, were from a unit that wasn't listed in her operational briefing. Emily Carter checked her ammunition, verified her secondary sidearm, and settled back behind her rifle. The city below her was quiet with the specific, dense silence of a fuse that has been lit and is burning. She began counting her angles. The unknown vehicle on the bridge didn't move for 40 minutes. Emily logged it, kept her scope on it, and spent the time doing what she'd been trained to do when there was no immediate action available. She observed. She built information. She waited for the environment to tell her what she couldn't see directly. It was during this waiting that she felt it. Not heard, not saw, felt. The roof had a specific quality of stillness to it, the settled, ambient quiet of an abandoned building in mid-afternoon heat, cut through by the dry desert wind and the distant radio traffic from the checkpoint below. She'd been up here long enough to know that stillness in the way you know the feel of your own kitchen in the dark. Every creak, every gust, every shift of gravel had a cause that she'd cataloged. The pigeon colony on the Paloma's east face had been cycling through their afternoon routine, settling, fluttering, resettling, in a pattern that had repeated itself roughly every 20 minutes. At 15:40, they didn't resettle. They lifted off the entire east face and banked hard south, fast, in the tight, panicked cluster that birds produce when something has disturbed their perch. Not a gust, not a cat, something larger, something that had arrived on or near that face of the building with enough presence to push the whole colony off at once. Emily did not move her rifle. She did not alter her scope direction. She moved only her eyes, slow, deliberate, toward the northeast corner of the roof, where the parapet met the elevator housing. Shadow pooled there in the late afternoon angle. Enough shadow to conceal a still figure, if that figure was good. She processed what she could see without giving away that she was looking. The parapet edge, 14 inches of concrete, rough surface, weathered. At its base, along the roofline, a thin layer of wind-deposited dust. Fine desert grit that settled on every horizontal surface in Cuervo Junction by mid-afternoon. The dust line along the northeast corner parapet was broken. Not disturbed, not kicked or scuffed, the way an amateur would disturb it. Broken. A precise, narrow interruption in the settled dust layer, approximately 8 inches wide, at a height consistent with a bipod, or two hands, prone, gripping the parapet edge. Someone was on this roof with her. Emily ran the geometry in her head without moving. The northeast corner had line of sight to the highway bridge, to the checkpoint's east side, to the 3-story brick hotel, and, with a slight angle adjustment, barely a degree and a half, to the Paloma's own northwest parapet where she was currently positioned. He can see me. She did not reach for her sidearm. She did not shift her weight. She breathed through her nose, slow and shallow, and stared through her scope at the bridge vehicle with the complete external stillness of someone who has not noticed anything unusual. And she thought, the brass on the northwest parapet, 3 to 4 days old. That was when this position had been scouted. Today, whoever it was had returned and taken the opposite corner, the northeast, which gave them an angle on her position that her own northwest setup did not cover. He hadn't come to shoot her. The shot at the parapet this morning, the deliberate 6-inch miss, had already established that. He'd come to watch her. She was being studied. She let 60 seconds pass. Then she performed a completely natural-looking scope adjustment, the kind a sniper makes to clear dust from a lens. And in the 4-second window of that motion, she turned her head 14 degrees and looked directly at the northeast corner. The shadow there was wrong, too dense, too consistent across the slight breeze that should have shifted it. A shape, prone, completely still. She completed her scope adjustment and returned to her forward position, and her heartbeat was controlled, and her hands were steady on the rifle. And behind her eyes, she was building everything she knew about the person in that corner into something she could work with. Not here to kill me, here to see what I do next. She keyed her radio quietly. Overwatch to base, situation stable, continuing observation. She got static. She wasn't calling base. She was establishing, for whoever was listening on the roof behind her, that she was reporting normally, conducting routine operations, and had not flagged anything unusual. Then she settled back behind her scope and began the most careful game of her career. The next 2 hours were the strangest of Emily Carter's professional life. They didn't fire, neither of them. The math was obvious. She was exposed on the northwest parapet. He was partially concealed in the northeast shadow, and either of them could have ended the other in under a second. But neither moved toward that. It wasn't a standoff. It was something more deliberate. He was testing her. She understood this gradually as the afternoon unwound and the incidents below continued their slow choreography. At 15:58, a segment of chain-link fencing along the checkpoint's east perimeter went down. A vehicle had apparently backed into it. She logged it as possibly accidental, probably not. At 16:12, the unidentified bridge vehicle finally moved, pulling north toward the highway interchange. And throughout all of it, she maintained her observation routine, logged her data, keyed radio traffic that went nowhere, and waited. Snipers understood waiting differently from other soldiers. Infantry waited in the aggressive, coiled way of people who needed to move. The tension building in the muscles, the need for action pressing against the discipline that kept them still. Snipers waited like water in a basin, settled, patient, taking the shape of the available space. Emily had spent hundreds of hours in hides, in Overwatch positions, in observation posts that were little more than a patch of shade and a good angle. And she had learned that time passed differently when you stopped fighting it. She stopped fighting it now. She let the afternoon happen around her. The heat beginning its long recession. The wind cycling through the street canyons below in its irregular, unpredictable patterns. The checkpoint, visible from her elevated vantage as a geometry of barriers and light towers, and small human figures who didn't know what was building around them. She logged and she watched and she breathed. And from the northeast corner of the Paloma roof, her counterpart did the same. At some point in that long, suspended hour, she stopped thinking of him as a threat. This happened without announcement. One moment she was tracking him as a danger in her peripheral awareness, an active variable requiring constant threat assessment, and then gradually, the threat calculus dissolved into something more complicated. He'd had a clean shot on her at least 3 times since she'd identified his position. He hadn't taken any of them. He'd moved his position twice, both times to a location that actually reduced his offensive angle on her, while improving his observational coverage of other sectors. He wasn't a killer on a rooftop. He was an observer, like her. He moved twice. The first time was subtle. A slight repositioning, she detected it through the dust layer, which showed a fresh disturbance point 2 inches south of the original, suggesting he'd shifted his weight to the right hip. The move had changed his angle by approximately 3 degrees. She recalculated. His new line of sight covered the customs warehouse loading dock. She moved her scope to the warehouse loading dock. The padlock was gone. The main gate was standing partially open, and inside, in the dim interior visible through the gate gap, something large and dark and rectangular was being moved by at least 2 people whose faces she couldn't resolve at this distance. She watched them for 90 seconds, careful, unhurried movement, the kind of movement that came from knowing you had time and cover. They were loading or unloading equipment. The way they handled it suggested weight, fragility, care. She logged it. Time, bearing, description, paper notebook. Then she moved her scope back to his position and found the dust line exactly as she'd left it, except for a fresh disturbance approximately 4 inches east of center. He'd moved again. This time his new angle covered, she traced the geometry, the 3-story brick hotel. Emily held her breath and looked at the hotel. 3rd floor, 2nd window from left. The curtain was moving. Not occupied, leaving. The displacement was outward, pushed aside from the inside, and then the window itself shifted slightly as someone moved away from it. Not the slow displacement of a curtain caught in a crossdraft. The deliberate, controlled movement of someone who has completed a task and is withdrawing from a position they no longer need. The hotel firing position was being vacated. Ghost Vulture had just shown her that phase of the operation was complete. She stayed absolutely still behind her rifle and let the information settle. He wasn't just watching her, he was directing her attention. The warehouse, the hotel, he was pointing at things, showing her the pieces, building her picture the same way she would have built it for a target who needed to understand something critical and had no time for a briefing. Why? She thought about the brass on the parapet, the deliberate miss this morning, the careful, professional way he'd taken a position that let him observe her without threatening her. The way he'd fired twice today, clean kills, precise impacts, and both times had done so from positions that gave him maximum control and minimum exposure. Clean shots, no collateral, no panic firing. He'd put 2 rounds exactly where they needed to go and then gone completely still. That was discipline. That was craft. This was not a soldier following orders. This was not cartel muscle or hired firepower. This was a craftsman, someone who thought in angles and sequences, in information architectures the way Emily did, who read a city the same way she read a city, as a system of overlapping sightlines, terrain channels, exposure windows, and timing constraints. And he was trying to communicate something she couldn't yet fully receive. At 1700 exactly, something happened that resolved the question completely. He fired. Not at her. Not at the checkpoint. A single, suppressed round. She heard the muted crack, felt the pressure differential in the open air, the way you feel it when a round goes past at a safe distance. Aimed at the east face of the grain elevator, 60 meters from her position. The round struck at a very specific point, a ventilation louver, second level, south face. The impact was not damaging. It was a tap, a percussion note against metal, loud enough to carry, carefully aimed to do nothing structural. She looked at the grain elevator. The louver had been dented slightly. The impact mark was at exactly the height where the south face wall met the cable routing conduit. She looked at what was behind the grain elevator. Behind it, in the dead ground between the elevator's south face and the customs warehouse fence, she could now see, barely at this angle, with the late afternoon light hitting at just the right oblique, a cable run. A thick bundle of coaxial and fiber cables running from somewhere underground, surfacing through a conduit pipe, and running up the elevator's south face toward, she tracked upward, toward a small equipment housing bolted to the elevator's roof. An equipment housing that had not been there when she'd mapped the building at 0530 this morning. Someone had installed it while she was watching the checkpoint. She pressed her eye to the scope and brought the housing into focus. It was roughly 40 centimeters square, matte black, military-grade weatherproofing. 2 antenna stubs protruded from the top. She recognized the form factor. She'd seen equipment like this in the Signals Intelligence training packet she'd completed 2 years ago at Fort Huachuca. The housing, the antenna configuration, the cable routing, it was a communications intercept and relay platform, portable, deployable in under 2 hours by a 2-person team with the right clearances. It was a command relay node, a portable military communications hub, capable of overriding or duplicating multiple frequency channels simultaneously, capable of inserting false traffic, capable of managing a communications environment without any of the receiving units knowing the channel had been compromised. Someone had put military signals hardware on the grain elevator while Cuervo Junction's entire emergency response apparatus was focused on phantom threats to the south. The game on the roof suddenly had different stakes. She looked northeast. The shadow in the corner was completely still. She looked at the relay housing. She looked back at the northeast corner. You needed me to see that, she thought. You needed the one person with eyes on this whole city to understand what's sitting on that elevator. She took a very slow breath. Who are you, and whose side are you on? Both questions mattered, but the second one, she was beginning to think she already knew the answer. At 1730, Holloway came back on the radio. Carter, his voice was low. Not compromised low, careful low, the register of a man speaking in a space where he wasn't alone, but the people around him weren't paying attention. Holloway, she kept her voice flat. Where are you? South Side, Warehouse District, Civilian Side. I'm looking at something you need to know about. A pause. She heard what might have been a vehicle engine in the background. The rerouting. You remember the map anomalies from this morning? Commercial traffic moving away from the checkpoint grid. I remember. It's not random. I pulled logistics records from the checkpoint system. They still had an unsecured terminal in the secondary processing trailer. Can you believe that? He almost sounded amused. Almost. For the past 11 days, every commercial supply route feeding the checkpoint has been incrementally rerouted. Not blocked, rerouted. Pushed onto alternate paths that add distance. Slow attrition. Water, food resupply, medical. A pause. Fuel. Emily felt the implication land. The checkpoint can't sustain a prolonged defensive posture. The checkpoint can sustain approximately 48 hours of active defensive operations on current fuel and supply reserves. His voice was completely even. After that, they either consolidate, fall back to a smaller footprint, or request emergency resupply through channels that require command authorization. Which command? That's the right question. She heard him move, footsteps on concrete, careful. The authorization chain for emergency resupply in this sector runs through Regional Command Southwest, which is, I want you to be sitting down for this, currently under the temporary authority of Brigadier General Mark Stanhope, who rotated in 60 days ago as acting commander, while General Flores is at Walter Reed. Emily turned this over. Stanhope, is that a name I should know? Probably not. He's been careful about that. Another pause, longer this time. Garza's buried report, the one that flagged the rerouting patterns as inconsistent with cartel activity. You know who Garza sent it to? She waited. Regional Command Southwest. Personal attention of the acting commander. The relay node on the grain elevator, the rerouted supply lines, the phantom threat vector directing all response assets south, while an unknown operator worked freely inside the city. Emily's mind assembled the architecture with a cold, mechanical clarity that made her exceptional at her job. This wasn't a cartel operation. It wasn't an insurgency. It was a managed event, designed, staged, and executed with military precision by people who understood military response systems well enough to manipulate them. Holloway, her voice was quieter now. There's a command relay node on the grain elevator, installed this afternoon, military-grade signals hardware. A long silence. When he spoke again, his voice had dropped further. Describe it. She described it. Dimensions, form factor, antenna configuration, cable routing. That's a Type 4 frequency bridge, he said. I've seen them in signals exercises. It can duplicate command channel traffic, insert false authentication headers, and relay orders that appear to originate from authorized sources. He paused. With that running, someone could issue checkpoint fire orders, patrol instructions, escalation authorizations, all appearing to come from legitimate command nodes, and the receiving units would have no way to know the difference. Emily looked at the relay housing. They don't need to fire the shots, she said slowly. They just need to control what happens after. Trigger the incident, control the response, direct the escalation. Holloway's voice was a flat recitation of someone naming a disaster clearly. Create an international incident at the U.S.-Mexico border that justifies a full military response. All documented, all authenticated, because the authentication system has been compromised. Emily's hands on the rifle were very still. Where are you specifically? She asked. Loading dock, south side of the customs warehouse. A pause. There's something here you need. Boxes of equipment stenciled with signals unit designations. But Carter, these aren't this sector's unit markings. They're from a specialized unit out of Fort Meade, Signals Intelligence. Another pause, heavier. Someone from Fort Meade's signals apparatus is running hardware in a border checkpoint city, off the books, outside any order structure I can account for. Holloway, something in her voice must have shifted because he went quiet. Get out of the warehouse, right now. There are two people inside that warehouse. I've been watching them for the past 40 minutes. You walked into an active site. A very short silence, then, moving. She heard his footsteps quicken. Then the radio went to static. The static lasted 9 minutes. Emily counted every one of them. She held her scope on the warehouse loading dock, watched the gate, which was now closed, scanned the surrounding streets. No movement she could attribute directly to Holloway. No sign of confrontation. On her radio, she tried the checkpoint, TOC, static. She tried the general command frequency, static. She switched to the emergency backup frequency, a carrier signal, the steady tone of a channel that was technically active but carrying no traffic. The relay node on the grain elevator. It had gone active. She couldn't prove it from here, but the timing was exact. 9 minutes after she'd last spoken to Holloway, all radio channels had degraded simultaneously, replaced by the specific quality of interference that a frequency bridge produces when it inserts itself into a communications architecture and begins managing traffic. Someone had just taken control of every radio channel in Cuervo Junction. Below her, at the checkpoint, she could see the effect in real time. Personnel were moving with the slightly confused urgency of people who had lost situational awareness. Small clusters forming, hand signals replacing radio comms. The checkpoint CO visible at the command vehicle's open door, clearly trying to reach someone. The bridge vehicle, a new one, this time a military-marked cargo truck, had appeared on the highway approach from the north. It stopped at the bridge's midpoint. Emily thought about what Holloway had told her. 48 hours of supplies. The relay node controlling communications. Command assets responding to a false threat vector. The checkpoint below her was isolated, confused, and being managed. She switched to her personal satellite phone. Personal, off-grid, not linked to any military channel. She dialed Holloway's number. 4 rings. Carter. His voice was tight but controlled. He was outside. She could hear wind. I'm clear of the warehouse. I'm on the north side of the elevator district, near the grain storage. A pause. There were 3 of them inside. Didn't see me, but I saw something before I cleared out. She heard him breathe. The equipment boxes. One of them was open. Inside, underneath the hardware, a folder. Physical documents, not digital. Operational timeline. Her chest tightened. What's on it? I only had about 15 seconds. His voice was measured, deliberate, extracting memory with precision. Phase markers. Phase 1 was preparation, completed, checkmark. Phase 2 was isolation, in progress, which matches the supply rerouting and comms interference. Phase 3 was labeled incident, no completion marker yet. A pause. Phase 4 was labeled authorization. Authorization for what? Wasn't labeled specifically, but it had a timeline window. He paused. Tonight, between 2200 and 2300 hours. Emily looked at her watch. 17:52. Just over 4 hours. There's something else, Holloway said. At the bottom of the timeline, a single line, handwritten, different handwriting from the rest. A pause. It said, "Let the Overwatch proceed." Silence on the line. Holloway, yeah? Someone on that operations team knows exactly who is sitting on the Paloma roof. Yeah, he said again, they do. She heard him moving again, careful footsteps on uncertain ground. I'm going to try to reach the warehouse from the east side, see if I can get a look at who's running this from the ground. Give me an hour. Keep logging. Holloway, I know, his voice was quieter now, genuine, without the dryness. You're doing good work, Carter. You've seen things today that would have gone past most people. A pause that held something unspoken in it. Keep seeing them. The line went dead. Clean disconnect, not interference. Emily looked at the city. 4 hours and 8 minutes. She rolled her neck, resettled behind the rifle, and began building her plan. 1900 came and went. Emily had logged 14 separate observations in the 90 minutes since Holloway's last contact. The checkpoint had partially reconfigured. Personnel pulled back from the outer perimeter, consolidating around the main barrier structures, a response consistent with communications failure protocols. The bridge vehicle had moved into a static position at the northern approach. The grain elevator relay node was still active, its antenna stubs catching the last of the late-day sun. The northeast corner of the Paloma roof was empty. She'd noted that at 1820, the shadow shape that had occupied the corner for several hours had dissolved at some point during her communications work. He'd moved without her detecting it, which told her two things. He was better than almost anyone she'd encountered, and he'd chosen to go, which meant he'd completed whatever he'd come to do. What he'd come to do was show her the relay node. She still didn't know what to do with that. At 1915, she tried Holloway's satellite phone again. No answer. She tried it at 1930, 1945, 2000. Nothing. She kept her movements controlled and her breathing even and her scope on the city, and she did not permit herself the spiral of worst-case scenarios that her mind kept offering. Holloway had been in worse situations than this. He was experienced, careful, and had spent decades in environments that ate careless people. He had told her to give him an hour. 3 hours had now passed. The intel he'd left her with was what she had. She went back to the operational timeline in her head. Phase 3, incident, still unmarked, which meant as of whenever Holloway had seen it, the triggering event hadn't happened yet. The timeline window was tonight, 22 to 2300. Whatever ghost vulture was going to fire, he was going to fire it in the next 3 hours. At 2010, her satellite phone buzzed. Not a call, a text from a number she didn't have logged. South side of grain elevator, ground level, maintenance door. What you need is inside. She looked at the phone for a long moment. Then she looked at the grain elevator, 140 meters southwest. It could be a trap. It was almost certainly a complication she didn't need with less than 3 hours to the Phase 3 window. The text had come from an unregistered number, which meant either Holloway had acquired a new device, possible if he'd found civilian equipment, or someone else was directing her. She thought about the roof of the Paloma, the brass, the deliberate miss, the pigeons, the 2 careful, choreographed hours of the invisible duel, during which he had shown her the warehouse, the hotel, and the relay node in precise sequence. Let the Overwatch proceed. She slung her rifle, secured the Paloma position as best she could in 4 minutes, and moved. The maintenance door was unlocked. Inside the grain elevator's ground level was a vaulted concrete space, smelling of old grain dust and machine oil, dimly lit by 2 emergency strip lights running on a backup battery. Large steel machinery, augers, conveyors, weighing mechanisms, loomed in the dimness like sleeping animals. Emily cleared the space in 90 seconds, working the corners with her sidearm, finding nothing. In the center of the floor, beside the base of a vertical conveyor housing, she found a military-issue nylon pouch. Inside, Holloway's satellite phone, screen cracked but functional, and a folded sheet of paper. She unfolded it. Holloway's handwriting, small, precise, the handwriting of a man who'd spent his career writing in cramped conditions. Carter, moving to secondary location, found something bigger. The timeline doc had an attachment I didn't mention on the phone, didn't want it on the air. Attachment was a targeting sheet, not people, infrastructure. The highway bridge is wired, shaped charges, south pylon, planted within the last 24 hours. If the bridge drops during the Phase 3 incident, the checkpoint is physically isolated, no vehicle access from the north. That's not a false flag, that's a siege. Second item, the relay node isn't just comms interference, it has a trigger function. If someone transmits a specific authentication code through it, it sends a detonation signal. Whoever has the authentication code controls the bridge. I'm going for the pylon. I can disarm it if I get there clean. If you don't hear from me by 21:30, assume I didn't. The Overwatch's job is the relay node. Not the sniper, the node. Take it out and the detonation signal can't transmit. You know what that shot looks like. Don't wait for orders. H. Emily read it twice. She folded it carefully and put it in her breast pocket. Outside, the desert night was cooling fast, the way desert nights do. The heat pouring upward from the pavement, leaving behind a knife-edge clarity of air and stars. She looked at the grain elevator's roof, where the relay node sat in the darkness, with its antenna stubs pointed at the sky. She had 108 minutes until the Phase 3 window opened. She went back to the Paloma roof and re-established position with 9 minutes elapsed, and her mind running very clean and very cold on a single track. The shot to the relay node was 212 meters. The wind at this hour was north-northeast at approximately 8 knots, with the canyon effect from the East Street adding a variable left drift component in the final 60 meters. The node was a 40-centimeter target. The antenna stubs were smaller. She'd need to hit the housing itself to guarantee destruction of the internal components. It was not a difficult shot by technical standards. The difficulty was everything else. At 2100, Ghost Vulture showed her the full board. It happened in 10 minutes, and Emily understood, watching it unfold through her scope, that she was witnessing something that had been months in the preparation. Not improvised, not adaptive. A rehearsed deployment, each element moving into its assigned position with the economy and precision of a mechanism that had been wound up long ago and was now simply running. 2 snipers appeared on the south side. Not cartel, these were professional placements, disciplined, moving into hide positions on the ridgeline above the river crossing with the economy of motion that came from rehearsal. She identified them by the way they settled, both going still at identical moments, the synchronization of people who had practiced this together. They moved to their positions without checking each other, without any of the lateral glancing that unpracticed teams showed when they were uncertain. They knew the ground, they'd been on it before. At the same time, a third position activated on the city's west side, the water tower, which she'd cataloged at 0530 as a potential hide site and then discounted because it was too obvious. Obvious unless you wanted it to be seen. Unless the point was that a trained observer would log it and consider and move on, never imagining that exactly that was the intent. She'd looked at the water tower this morning, and her professional instinct had said, no one competent would use that. Too exposed, too predictable. She'd been right that no one competent would use it as a primary position. She'd been wrong about everything else. They were using it because its exposure didn't matter, because by the time anyone identified it as the source of a shot, the shot would already have done its work. A sniper position doesn't have to be survivable. It just has to produce the one round at the one moment that the operation requires. The water tower position had line of sight to the checkpoint's main barrier. One shot at the right moment, hitting the right target, and the entire response apparatus would reorient. Not south, not east. It would spin in confusion, unable to identify direction, unable to distinguish attacker from responder, unable to do anything except react to an environment that had been designed to prevent coherent reaction. The 2 South Ridge positions had line of sight to the crossing itself, the physical border, the vehicle lanes, the approach infrastructure. Those shots were the opening move, the international incident, the moment that would put the incident on satellite feeds and news tickers and command monitors across 2 countries. Those shots would bring everyone to their radios, and their decision trees, and their escalation protocols, all of which would be managed by the relay node sitting on the grain elevator, feeding false authentication into every frequency simultaneously. And somewhere in the city, a position she still hadn't located had line of sight to. She worked the geometry, the angles, the coverage gaps, methodically, the way you solve a puzzle when the stakes of getting it wrong are catastrophic. To the checkpoint CO's vehicle, the command node. Remove the CO, remove coherent decision-making, and the response to the cartel attack was headless. Units acting on compromised channel traffic. Nobody with the authority and awareness to say, "Stop, something is wrong here." 4 positions, coordinated, sequenced. At 2200, when Phase 3 opened, they would fire in sequence. She could model the sequence from the geometry. Ridge positions first, targeting the crossing. That was the international incident, the shots that crossed the border. The water tower next, targeting the barrier. That was the confusion layer, the shots that would look like they'd come from the south in the chaos. Then the command node, removing the one person who might have the situational awareness to resist the compromised channel traffic. And underneath all of it, the relay node running constantly, managing the command channel traffic, making every action look official, documented, authorized. A false flag operation that would be completely self-authenticating. No one would need to lie afterward, because the record itself would have been fabricated in real time. She had 58 minutes. Holloway's note: the Overwatch's job is the relay node. But Holloway hadn't known about the 4th position, the command node sniper. If she took the relay node at, say, 2130, early enough to prevent the detonation signal, the 4 snipers would still be in position. They could still fire. Without the relay node's false authentication, they couldn't control the response, but they could still trigger the initial incident, still kill people, still create the international flashpoint that justified the military response that Stanhope, or whoever was above Stanhope, whoever was running this at the top, needed. She needed to disrupt the shooting positions, not just the electronics. She had 1 rifle and 4 targets spread across a city. She ran the math, and the math was brutal. 4 positions spread across 360 degrees of city with unobstructed lines of sight to their respective targets. She could reach 2 of them from the Paloma roof, the water tower and the relay node, and neither of the South Ridge positions, which were outside her effective engagement envelope at this hour with this wind. She could engage 1 position before the others went mobile and reactive. 1. After that, the remaining positions would be alerted, would move, would shift from planned operation to chaos management. And chaos was harder to manage, but also harder to stop. They'd abort or they'd improvise. And either way, the night became unpredictable in ways she couldn't control. Unless the chaos disrupts the sequence. She stared at the water tower. The water tower position was the linchpin. It was the shot that turned an international incident into a bilateral engagement. The shot that made it look like Americans were firing back at Americans. That created the confusion within the confusion. Without it, the South Ridge shots still happen, but the response had a chance to be coherent, to identify the actual threat vector. Confused, yes. Undermanned, yes, but coherent. And the water tower was 230 meters from the Paloma. She moved her scope to the relay node, 212 meters. She moved it back to the water tower. She had 1 shot window before the whole city woke up. She could take the node, or she could take the water tower position. Not both. Unless. She looked at both targets for a long time. Let the geometry work in the back of her mind, the way it did when she stopped trying to force a solution and let the spatial relationships find their own resolution. The relay node was on the south face of the grain elevator. The water tower was 80 meters east of the grain elevator. They were not the same shot, But if the relay node's antenna housing catastrophically failed, if it didn't just stop transmitting but shattered with enough force to produce a significant secondary effect, the explosion would be visible from every position in the city. Every sniper, every operator, every person running Phase 3 would see it. They would know their comms architecture had been compromised. They would know the relay node was gone. They would know that someone with a rifle and the right intelligence had been watching all day. In that moment of uncertainty, a professional would do one of two things: execute immediately before the window closed entirely, or abort because the conditions for a controlled operation no longer existed. And Ghost Vulture, whoever he was, whoever had originally sent him here, whatever choices he had made along the way, had not struck her as someone who worked with people who acted on degraded conditions. This operation was too precise, too controlled, too expensive in terms of planning and assets and institutional access to be the work of people who improvised under pressure. These were people who needed the conditions to be exact, who had built in months of preparation to ensure exactness, who had buried reports and reassigned officers and rerouted supply lines specifically to create the exact conditions they needed. Show them conditions that weren't exact. Show them a city where the Overwatch was awake and armed and had already documented everything in a paper log that was sitting in a breast pocket and couldn't be deleted from a server. Give them a reason to believe that Phase 3, executed tonight, would not produce a controlled outcome. She had 53 minutes. She began her final preparations. At 21:20, Ghost Vulture came back. She felt him before she located him. The same quality of altered stillness on the roof that she'd learned to read that afternoon. But this time he wasn't in the northeast corner. He was on the south face, closer, 12 meters from her position. And when she found him in her peripheral vision, she saw that he'd made himself marginally visible, deliberately. He was prone behind the parapet, rifle pointed south toward the checkpoint, not at her. And he was looking at her. She could see his face well enough in the ambient light to register that it was a man, 40-something, lean, wearing no unit markings on his dark outer garment. His face was the face of someone who had been outside and operational for a long time. Not weathered in the way of age, but in the way of sustained field work. He held up his left hand, 3 fingers, then moved them apart, spreading slowly, a deliberate gesture. She held her position, her rifle still pointed south, watching him. 3 fingers, then a slow spread. She thought about Scene 14 in the architecture of what he'd shown her. The 3 warning shots in the outline she'd constructed in her head. Not a threat, a pattern. He'd communicated through bullets already. Now he was doing it with his hand. 3. Spread. 3 targets to spread across, or you have 3 choices, or 3 positions active tonight. She held up 2 fingers. He looked at them, then held up 4 fingers and pointed south. 4 positions. He was confirming what she'd mapped. She pointed at the grain elevator. He looked at the elevator, then back at her. He touched 2 fingers to his own chest, then pointed at the highway bridge. I'm going for the bridge. Emily felt something shift in her understanding so fundamentally that she had to keep her body completely still to prevent it from showing. He wasn't running the operation. He was opposing it. He'd been inside it, had to have been, to know this much, to be positioned here. And somewhere along the sequence, he'd made a different choice. The brass on the Paloma roof, the message for whoever came next. He'd been leaving breadcrumbs for the Overwatch before she arrived, in case he couldn't communicate directly. He'd known there would be an Overwatch. He'd known the Overwatch would need to understand what they were looking at. She pointed at the relay node. He nodded. She held up her watch and made a questioning gesture. He held up 2 fingers, then made a fist. 2200, then made a cutting gesture with his hand, before 2200. She had 38 minutes. He looked at her for a moment longer, a specific, level regard that contained something she couldn't fully translate, but read as a kind of professional recognition. Two people on opposite sides of a dark city, on a rooftop, speaking in the sign language of people who understood the same things. Then he was moving, low and fast along the parapet, and in 6 seconds the south face of the Paloma roof was empty again. She looked at the grain elevator. 38 minutes. She had to be certain. Everything she'd built since 0917 rested on observation, inference, and the testimony of a man she'd known for 12 hours who had shown her things through bullets and hand gestures. None of it was provable. None of it would hold in a formal review against the official record, which currently described today as a cartel escalation requiring defensive response. Before she fired a round at military hardware on American soil and blew her career and possibly her freedom, she needed one more piece. She went back to Holloway's note. The relay node isn't just comms interference, it has a trigger function. If the relay node had a trigger function, if it could transmit a detonation signal, then it had been programmed with a specific authentication code. And that code had to have come from somewhere. A signals unit, an operational authority, someone who had the access and the expertise to program military-grade relay hardware with a custom detonation protocol. Fort Meade, signals intelligence apparatus. That was what Holloway had said about the equipment boxes in the warehouse. She pulled out her personal phone and opened the browser. No military network, no authentication, just civilian LTE running through whatever cell tower was still operational in Cuervo Junction. She searched the name Holloway had given her. Brigadier General Mark Stanhope, Regional Command Southwest, Temporary Authority. 3 minutes of searching pulled up a service record summary on a public military database. A standard career bio, the kind that got posted to command websites when an officer rotated in. Stanhope, Signal Corps background, Fort Meade assignment, 2019 to 2021. Department of the Army Staff, Special Projects, 2021 to 2023. Regional Command Southwest, acting, current, Signal Corps, Fort Meade, Special Projects. She put the phone away. She looked at the relay node through her scope. 40 centimeters of matte black housing sitting on the grain elevator roof in the desert night, its antenna stubs quiet against the stars. She thought about Garza's buried report, about the rerouted supply lines, about the operational timeline with its 4 phases and its handwritten final line, "Let the Overwatch proceed." That line hadn't been written for her. It had been written for Ghost Vulture. He'd been in that warehouse before Holloway. He'd read the timeline and added that line himself. A message to whoever was running Phase 3 that the sniper on the Paloma roof was not a threat to the operation, that she should be left in place. He'd protected her, given her the space and the time to see what she needed to see. He'd wanted an outside witness in position with full observational coverage before the Phase 3 incident, because the incident would generate a documentation record, and if that record included a contemporaneous Overwatch log from a U.S. Army recon sniper who had been logging impact vectors and bearing anomalies all day, it would be the one piece of evidence that couldn't be retroactively managed. Her log was the insurance policy, and Ghost Vulture had been protecting the insurance policy. She understood now, all of it. The shape of the whole thing, from the brass on the parapet to this moment, sitting behind her rifle in the desert dark with 22 minutes left. She opened her notebook and wrote carefully on a fresh page, 22 hours. Position, Paloma Hotel roof, Cuervo Junction. Summary of observations 0530 to 2122. The following constitutes a complete contemporaneous record of activities observed from this Overwatch position. She wrote for 6 minutes. Everything. Bearings, times, impact vectors, the relay node, Holloway's intelligence, the Ghost Vulture communications, the 4 sniper positions. She wrote it in the precise, terse style of a military log, with no editorializing and no speculation. Only what she had directly observed, times verified, bearings verified. She tore the pages out carefully and put them in the same pocket as Holloway's note. Then she settled behind her rifle and began her final calculation. 21:53, 7 minutes. Through her scope, Cuervo Junction lay spread out in the night, checkpoint lights burning in the south, the highway bridge dark except for a single amber maintenance lamp, the grain elevator's bulk against the stars, and everywhere the quiet of a city that didn't know what was about to happen to it. A city that had been slowly emptied and isolated and positioned for use like a prop on a stage, and the curtain was 7 minutes from rising. The two South Ridge positions were confirmed at 21:40, both still in place. She could see the slight heat signature from one position where a body had been lying against rock for long enough to warm the stone surface below it. Patient, professional, completely still. The water tower had a confirmed presence at 21:45. She'd resolved the shape as human by the way it was attached to the ladder structure, not gripping a rung, but using the ladder as a brace, leaning into it from behind at an angle that gave the rifle a stable platform while keeping the body off the tank's visible silhouette. Smart, practiced, someone who'd done this before and knew the difference between a position that worked and a position that merely looked like it should work. The fourth position, the command node sniper, she'd finally located at 21:50, not in the city, on the highway approach north of the bridge, using the cargo truck as cover. A window of the truck's passenger side was open precisely the width required for a rifle muzzle. Not all the way open, not conspicuously open, just the width a person opens a window when it's warm and they want air. 200 meters from the checkpoint CO's vehicle. A shot most snipers wouldn't take at night through a vehicle window across 200 meters with a specific terminal effect required. This person would take it. 4 positions, bridge wired, relay node active, comms compromised, command assets confused and consolidated, supply lines severed. The entire engagement environment shaped and managed and ready to execute. And on the bridge, somewhere, Jack Holloway was either disarming a shaped charge or he was already down. She had not heard from him since the maintenance door. 2 hours and 11 minutes of silence that she had carried in the back of her awareness like a physical weight, refusing to let it affect her breathing or her hands or her eye behind the scope, because she could not afford to let it. She would feel it later. Right now she needed the part of herself that went cold and clear and mathematical, and she needed it to stay that way for 7 more minutes. She had to move in the next 4 before the positions finalized their sector checks. Her options resolved themselves with the binary clarity of a targeting problem. Option 1, engage the water tower position. 1 shot, suppressed, clean. A human target at 230 meters. Her strongest engagement scenario tonight, wind compensated, range verified. The linchpin taken out. Without the water tower shot, the sequence lost its internal confusion layer. The South Ridge shots still happen, but they had a single identifiable origin and a coherent response was possible. But the relay node stayed active. The bridge charges stayed hot. Holloway had at most an extra few minutes before the sequence adapted, and she would be firing on a person whose identity and affiliations she couldn't fully verify under the specific legal framework of rules of engagement she was operating under. A person who might be a witting participant in a conspiracy or might be a soldier who had received orders through compromised channels and had no idea what those orders were actually serving. She had no authority to fire. She was on a hold position order from command, a command channel that was currently being managed by the relay node. She had no way to reach anyone outside the compromised architecture except her personal satellite phone, and there was no one she could reach in 4 minutes who had the authority and the information to authorize what she was about to do. She was completely alone with this. Option 2, Destroy the relay node. 40-centimeter target. 212 meters. The M110's suppressor would reduce sound signature, but not the visible effect. A destructive round hitting an electronic housing on an elevated structure would produce sparks, secondary ignition from the internal components, a flash visible across the city. Every position would see it. Every operator running Phase 3 would know the comms architecture had been hit. The detonation signal couldn't transmit. Holloway had more time at the bridge. The false authentication stream went dark. But the 4 positions would still be operational. The incident could still happen. People at the checkpoint, Ruiz's colleagues, the personnel she'd been watching all day, people who had no idea they were inside a manufactured kill zone, could still die. And she would have fired on military hardware on American soil without orders, without authorization, in direct defiance of the hold position she'd been given. She would have destroyed a piece of equipment whose existence she had no documented proof of, beyond her own field notes and a dead man's note in her pocket. Powerful people had built this operation carefully. They would build the aftermath just as carefully. A rogue Army recon sniper who destroyed military hardware and went off script. That was a narrative they could use, especially if the log in her pocket somehow didn't survive. She thought about what Holloway had said at the Paloma roof that afternoon, standing with his hand on the stairwell door and the whole city laid out below. If something smells like a setup, it's usually worse than that. She thought about what he'd written in the grain elevator. Don't wait for orders. She thought about the log, the pages in her breast pocket, the contemporaneous record that couldn't be retroactively altered because it was paper, was written, was specific, and would say exactly what she had seen and when she had seen it. The insurance policy. The reason Ghost Vulture had protected the Overwatch position all day. The log only matters if what comes next is something a log can survive. She looked at the relay node. She thought about Holloway on the bridge in the dark. She thought about Ruiz, who had run the same patrol route 3 times per shift and never come home from the 3rd one. She thought about the 11,000 people on the Cuervo Junction sign, the 4,000 or so who hadn't left yet, who were in their houses with their curtains drawn, listening to helicopters and radio traffic, and waiting for someone in authority to tell them what was happening. She thought about the handwritten line at the bottom of the operational timeline. Let the Overwatch proceed. Whoever had written that line had decided that the Overwatch mattered, had protected her, had positioned Ghost Vulture to communicate with her, had built the entire structure of this day around the premise that the person on the Paloma roof, seeing it clearly, was important. Important enough to change the outcome? She put her crosshair on the relay node's housing. She adjusted for the 8-knot north-northeast wind. She adjusted for the canyon effect left drift in the final 60 meters. She confirmed her range. She found her breathing. The antenna stubs caught a sliver of moonlight against the dark sky. If I miss, everything collapses. She'd been shooting since she was 19 years old. She'd been doing this specifically, precise work, single round, one chance, for 4 years. She had never missed a shot that mattered. She let half a breath out. Her finger found the trigger. She fired. The round left the barrel at 21:54 and 11 seconds. Emily tracked it through the scope with the focused, detached clarity that came after the trigger broke. The half-second window in which a sniper has done everything they can do, and the physics are simply running. Wind compensation, range, can't. She'd accounted for all of it. The canyon effect drift in the final 60 meters, the temperature differential between the warm pavement below and the cooler air at rooftop level, which changed the round's arc by a fraction of a degree that would have been irrelevant at 200 meters, but was not irrelevant when the target was 40 centimeters across and contained electronics that needed to be destroyed, not grazed. The round hit the relay node's housing at the lower left corner, exactly where she'd aimed. Not center mass, the internal component architecture of a signals relay node placed the primary transmitter and the trigger circuit in the lower half of the housing, not the upper. She'd learned that at Fort Huachuca. She'd been hoping the knowledge was current. It was. The housing detonated. Not a small failure, a full secondary ignition as the internal battery pack ruptured and the capacitors discharged simultaneously into a closed metal container. The flash was white-orange, brief but intense, visible across 360 degrees of Cuervo Junction. The antenna stubs were gone. The housing was gone. A column of gray smoke rose from the grain elevator roof into the still desert night. For approximately 4 seconds, nothing else happened. She was already reloading. Bolt back, round-chambered, bolt forward. Her scope found the water tower. The shape at the water tower ladder was moving, not withdrawing, reacting. The sniper there had seen the relay flash and was doing what any trained operator would do in a compromised scenario. Assess, decide, communicate. Except his communication architecture had just been destroyed. He had no channel to his command structure. He was isolated on a position that was now at risk of identification, with an unknown variable in the city, an Overwatch he might or might not have known about, having just announced itself dramatically. He was going to abort. Emily held her scope on the water tower and watched the decision happen in real time. The shape detached from the ladder, began moving down, not the fast, exposed descent of someone panicking, but the careful, controlled movement of someone trained to withdraw from a blown position. He was going down the far side of the tank, keeping the bulk of the tower between himself and any potential observation from the south. He was leaving. She did not fire. She moved her scope south. The ridge positions were active, both shapes moving now, reacting to the flash, the same assessment happening simultaneously. She watched them and tracked and waited. One of them had their rifle up, scanning the city skyline, looking for the source of the explosion, looking for her. She dropped below the parapet level, lay flat on the gravel of the Paloma roof, her rifle pulled down with her, the gravel pressing through her jacket into her ribs. She breathed. She counted. She gave it 30 seconds. When she came back up, both South Ridge positions were empty. She swung to the cargo truck on the highway approach. The truck window was closed. The truck itself was moving, pulling north, away from the checkpoint, at a pace that was brisk without being flight. The fourth operator was withdrawing. All 4 positions, in the absence of communication, in the presence of a visible compromise, had defaulted to the same professional judgment. The operation was blown, the controlled conditions were gone, Phase 3 was aborted. Emily let out a long, slow breath. It had worked. Then her satellite phone buzzed in her chest pocket. She answered it before the second buzz. Carter. Holloway's voice was tight, compressed, the voice of someone who has been working physically hard and is managing the output of exertion. I'm here. The node is down. All 4 positions are withdrawing. A brief silence. You sure? Confirmed visual. Ridge positions cleared. Water tower cleared. Highway vehicle moving north. She was still scanning as she spoke, cycling through sectors with the scope. Bridge? Bridge is clear. She heard him exhale, a long, controlled release that told her everything about what the last 2 hours had been. 2 charges. South pylon, like the document said. I got the first one clean. The second one was wired to a secondary trigger, motion sensor backup. I had to work around it. A pause. That took time I didn't have. How bad? I'm fine. The way he said it meant he wasn't entirely fine, but was categorically not dead and not incapacitated, which was the threshold they were both working with tonight. Hands are cut up. Took a fall on the pylon framework. Bruised, maybe cracked, 2 ribs on the left side. I've had worse. Holloway. I know. His voice softened slightly. I'm walking. Tell me about the node. She told him. The shot, the secondary ignition, the reactions from the four positions. She told him about Ghost Vulture, the roof conversation, the hand signals, the confirmation that he'd gone for the bridge before she'd found Holloway's note. A long pause when she finished. "He knew about the bridge," Holloway said, "before I did. He's been inside this operation longer than either of us. Then he's either the bravest or the most reckless person working tonight." Another pause. "Or both." She looked out over the city. The smoke from the grain elevator had thinned, dispersing in the desert breeze, rising into the stars and becoming nothing. At the checkpoint below, the personnel were still in their consolidated defensive positions, still operating in the comms blackout that the relay node's destruction had not resolved. The node was gone, but so was the managed traffic it had been producing. The channels were genuinely dead now, not falsely managed. Real silence. Real silence was recoverable. Real silence didn't issue orders. "Command is going to be re-establishing comms in the next 30 minutes, Emily said. "When they do, we have a problem." "We have several problems. Which one specifically?" "The official record of today says cartel escalation. 2 people dead. The driver of that truck and Ruiz, both attributed to Southern Fire. My radio reports flagging the bearing discrepancies are logged in a system that the relay node was managing for part of the day. I don't know what's in that log and what isn't." "But you have your notebook." "I have my notebook." "Then we have something." His voice was steady. "Carter, you did good work today. You held the line when the line was invisible, and you made the right call when nobody was watching. That matters." She looked at the grain elevator roof. The housing was gone. The antenna stubs were gone. And somewhere in the ruins of the housing, the authentication codes and the detonation protocols and the signals architecture that Stanhope or his people had built were melted into slag. "Holloway, whoever was running this still has people in the command structure. The relay node is gone, but the people who built it aren't." "No," he agreed, "they're not." "So what do we do?" "What soldiers do," he said. "We document everything. We stay with our accounts. We give them no gaps to work with." A pause. "And we find out who else Garza sent that report to before they buried it." She hadn't thought of that. Someone might still have a copy. Federal liaisons are cautious people. Garza filed that report to Regional Command Southwest because that was the right channel. But cautious people use backup channels. She could hear him moving now. Slow, careful footsteps. The gait of someone managing a rib injury across rough terrain. "I have a name. An agent at DHS who worked the same border sector as Garza 8 years ago. They stayed in contact. It's possible, it's not certain, but it's possible, that Garza sent a copy somewhere that Regional Command Southwest couldn't touch." Emily stared at the checkpoint below. The checkpoint that was still standing. The bridge that was still standing. The 1,100 people left in Cuervo Junction who were still, unknowingly, alive. "Can you get to me?" she asked. 20 minutes. A pause. "Sit tight." She sat tight. He came from the south side of the Paloma. She heard him before she saw him. Not footsteps, which she wouldn't have heard at this distance in this wind, but the specific, subtle sound of a stairwell door opening, which the Paloma's fire door produced as a distinctive, low groan, regardless of how carefully it was open. She'd cataloged it her first morning here. She was on her feet with her sidearm drawn before the door had fully opened. The figure that came through it stopped immediately, hands visible, weapons slung. The same lean, dark-clad figure she'd watched from 12 meters on the south parapet, face partially visible in the rooftop's ambient light. He held still with the practiced patience of someone who understood exactly what was pointing at him and why. "You have 3 seconds to tell me who you are," Emily said. "My name is Reyes." His voice was flat, controlled, accented in a way she couldn't immediately place. Not regional American, not Spanish dominant. Something in between, or something that had spent time in both. I work for a department you don't have clearance to know the name of. I have credentials in my left jacket pocket. I'm going to reach for them slowly. Slowly, he reached, extracted a slim, dark wallet, extended it toward her. She didn't lower the sidearm to take it. Talk first. Stanhope recruited me 14 months ago for what he called a border security evaluation project. Classified, compartmentalized, plausible deniability on every level. I spent 6 months building the operational framework before I understood what the framework was actually for. He held the wallet steady, his eyes on her face. Not her weapon, her face. Reading her the way a professional read a threat situation for the variable that actually mattered. When I understood, I had two options: disappear or stay and document. You stayed. I stayed. I built the record from inside. Every communication, every operational order, every personnel action, everything that could be documented was documented. His voice was even. I needed the operation to get far enough along that the documentation would be legally actionable. Not a plan on paper, an executed conspiracy with a body count and an observable operational record. A pause. I also needed a witness who wasn't inside the chain of command, someone whose record couldn't be questioned. Emily lowered the sidearm to low ready. Not holstered, low ready. The brass on the parapet, she said. I was here 3 days before you arrived, setting the forward documentation cache. He paused. I missed a piece of brass. That's the first mistake I've made in 14 months. I don't usually miss things. You missed it deliberately. He was quiet for a moment. I knew the Overwatch position would be staffed by someone who'd find it. I knew what a professional would conclude from it. Yes. A pause that was almost something else. Not quite an apology, not quite acknowledgement. Deliberately. She looked at him across the dark rooftop. This man who had spent 14 months inside a conspiracy that could have ended him at any point. Building a case from the inside with the patience of someone who had decided that the documentation mattered more than the personal risk. Who had fired 2 shots today that had killed 2 people. Because the operation needed those shots to proceed, to generate the record, to give the conspiracy enough operational shape that the documentation was actionable. She thought about Ruiz, running his 3 times per shift perimeter patrol. The truck driver, she said, and Agent Ruiz. We're both going to die tonight regardless. His voice didn't change. Stanhope's timeline had 5 targets scheduled for Phase 3. The shots I fired today gave us 2 deaths instead of 5, and gave us the bearing records from your observation log as documented evidence of internal origin. A pause. I am not asking you to believe those were clean choices. They were not. I will live with them. The desert wind moved between them. Emily had spent today watching a city being prepared for use. She had watched Ruiz walk his patrol route and then not come back from it. She had fired a round tonight at a piece of hardware and gambled the lives of everyone at that checkpoint on her ability to make a shot she'd made 100 times in training and never once in an operation with these stakes. None of the choices today had been clean. That was the thing about this kind of war, the kind that happened in the gaps between orders, in the space between what command said and what was actually happening. None of the choices were clean. They were just better or worse. And sometimes better or worse was all the clarity you got. Your documentation, she said. Where is it? Encrypted, 3 separate locations, one of which is not in this country. He finally lowered the credential wallet. If I don't make contact in the next 48 hours, it publishes automatically to 6 recipients, including 2 federal judges and a select committee staffer who has been waiting for evidence of exactly this kind of operation for 3 years. And if you do make contact, then I decide what to do with it based on what happens in the next 48 hours. He looked at her steadily. I would like to include your observation log, with your consent. Emily looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached into her breast pocket and pulled out the folded pages. She held them out. He took them with both hands, looked at her once more. "Carter," he said, "the relay node. What about it?" "That was a difficult shot in those conditions." He paused. "You didn't miss." She holstered her sidearm. "I never miss," she said. He went down the stairs. Holloway arrived 19 minutes later. He came up the stairwell, moving slower than he had that afternoon. His left hand braced against the wall for the last 2 flights. When he came through the door onto the roof, she could see the damage in the way he held his body. His left side was slightly contracted, the unconscious protective posture of ribs that were reporting acute objections to the act of breathing. His hands were wrapped with strips of torn jacket material, both palms. His face was its normal, weathered self, expression unchanged, eyes still the flat, steady gunmetal gray that processed everything without visible reaction. He looked at the grain elevator, at the smoke trace, thin now, barely visible. "Clean hit," he said. "Lower housing, battery and capacitor both went." He nodded. Then he sat down on the gravel of the Paloma roof with the careful, controlled motion of someone lowering a valuable object, and he looked at the city. Emily sat beside him. For a moment, neither of them said anything. Below, the checkpoint was beginning to stir. Comms restoration, she guessed. Someone had gotten a satellite link working, or had managed to reach an adjacent sector by runner or vehicle. Small figures were moving with more purpose now, the consolidated defensive posture beginning to unfold back into something operational. She told him about Reyes. He listened without interrupting, which was how Holloway listened when something mattered. He didn't nod or make affirmative sounds. He simply held still and processed, and when she finished, he was quiet for 30 seconds. "Reyes," he said finally, "that name doesn't match anyone in the operational roster I was given." "It wouldn't." "No." He exhaled slowly, and she heard the controlled quality of it, the deliberate management of the pain in his left side. 14 months. He's been running that long, inside that operation, without getting burned. He paused. Either he's exceptional, or Stanhope's people got sloppy. Both, probably. He took the log pages. "Good." Holloway looked at his wrapped hands. "Your radio transmissions from today are in whatever the relay node was managing. We don't know the state of that record." Reyes said he has documentation of everything on Stanhope's side. If that documentation includes the relay node's traffic management functions, it shows the bearing reports were received and suppressed. He finished the sentence without inflection, simply completing the logic, which corroborates the notebook. A pause. "Carter, that's enough. That's more than enough. Cases get built on less." She looked at the checkpoint. 2 deaths today, both logged as cartel fire, both attributed south, both now sitting in an official record that said something demonstrably different from what her field notebook said. "They'll try to manage the aftermath," she said. "They will. Stanhope has the command authority to shape what gets reported from this sector." "For a while," Holloway's voice was measured, "but the node is gone, and Reyes has what he has, and you have what you have." He looked at her. "Garza filed a report. It got buried. But Garza filed it, which means Garza knew something was wrong, which means Garza is still out there and still knows what he knows." A pause. "Corruption at this level requires the conspiracy to hold completely. One thread, and the whole thing starts to unravel." Emily thought about the operational timeline. Phase 3, incident, unmarked. Still unmarked because Phase 3 had not occurred as designed. The bridge was standing. The checkpoint was still operational. The relay node was slag on a grain elevator roof. "They'll redesign," she said. "Yes. They'll try again." "Probably." He met her gaze with the level directness that she'd come to understand as his version of honest. Not consoling, not dismissive. Accurate. "That's not tonight's problem. Tonight's problem was this city. Tonight, This city is still standing." He paused. "That was your work." She looked out at Cuervo Junction, the checkpoint lights, the half-darkened streets, the water tower, the bridge, the highway running north into the dark desert until it became something too far away to see. A city that had been set up to burn and had not burned. It didn't feel triumphant. It felt like the particular weight of having done a necessary thing at a cost that hadn't finished being tallied. That, she was beginning to understand, was what most of the necessary things felt like. The comms came back at 22:40. Emily had re-established her position by then, back behind the M110, scope on the checkpoint, logging the last of the evening's observable activity. The smoke from the grain elevator was gone. The 4 positions were gone. Cuervo Junction was quiet in the specific, dense way of a place where something significant had almost happened and hadn't, which was its own particular kind of silence. Lieutenant Morales' voice on the command channel was brisk, professional, carrying the slightly elevated register of someone who had been out of communications for an hour and was reasserting control. "All units, this is command. Comms restored. Situation report. We experienced a communications disruption consistent with electronic interference. Origin unknown. The checkpoint has sustained 2 casualties from today's cartel engagement. Border defense posture is currently elevated. All units report status." Emily listened. She listened to the after-action begin assembling in real time, on the frequency she could hear through her radio. The checkpoint CO reporting his personnel status. The patrol units reporting their positions. The slow accumulation of an official record, pieced together from what people had seen and what the compromised system had told them they'd seen, coalescing into a version of the day that bore the approximate shape of something that had happened while being factually incorrect about nearly every detail that mattered. She keyed her radio. "Overwatch to command." A beat. "Go ahead, Overwatch. I have a situation report from this position, logging full observation record for today, 05:30 to 22:40. I will transmit written log upon extraction." She paused. "Including documented bearing discrepancies on both casualty incidents, observed third-party activity in the customs warehouse and grain elevator, and communications interference timeline." A longer pause from Morales. "Overwatch, be advised. The official assessment is cartel engagement from the southern sector. Are you reporting something inconsistent with that assessment?" Emily looked at the checkpoint, at the lights, at the figures moving below. "I'm reporting what I observed from this position," she said. "Time-stamped, bearing verified, field log. Command can assess against that data as appropriate." Static. Then Morales, carefully. "Understood, Overwatch. We'll debrief on extraction. Stand by for pickup at 0600. She stood by. She knew what the debrief would look like. She knew the shape of what was coming. The careful questions, the institutional pressure toward a narrative that aligned with the official record. The very polite and very firm suggestion that a junior NCO's field observations were perhaps not the appropriate basis for challenging a command-level assessment of a cartel engagement. She had been in the Army long enough to understand how these things worked. And she had been in Cuervo Junction long enough today to understand that understanding how things worked was not the same as accepting how things worked. She had a field notebook. She had Holloway's testimony. She had Reyes and whatever Reyes had built over 14 months. She had done what soldiers were supposed to do. She settled back behind her rifle and watched the checkpoint and waited for morning. The helicopter came at 0610, 10 minutes late, which told Emily something about the conversation that had preceded its dispatch. She was down from the Paloma by 0545, her position cleared, the brass from her position bagged and accounted for, every trace of her presence cataloged. She met Holloway at the northeast corner of the grain elevator district in the pre-dawn gray that preceded the desert sunrise. And for a moment, they simply stood together in the early quiet. He looked worse in daylight. The rib situation was evident in the set of his shoulders, and his hands, rewrapped with medical tape she'd given him from her kit, were more damaged than he'd indicated on the phone. She looked at the hands and did not say anything about them, because there was nothing useful to say, and Holloway would not have welcomed it anyway. "How are you going to play the debrief?" she asked. "Same way I play everything." He looked at the highway, where the extraction bird would come in from the north. "Exactly what I observed. Exactly what I can document. No editorializing, no conclusions beyond what the evidence supports." A pause. "You?" "Same," he nodded. "They'll push back." "I know. Stanhope has friends. People who'll be motivated to see this as a junior NCO with an overactive imagination and a compass error." He looked at her. "That's going to be a comfortable explanation for a lot of people who don't want a different explanation." "I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. The gray light was strengthening, picking out the details of the elevator district. The grain elevator with its scorched roof fixture, the customs warehouse with its freshly padlocked gate, the highway bridge standing intact over the dry riverbed below. All of it looking, in the morning light, almost ordinary. The kind of scene you'd pass through without stopping. "Reyes," Holloway said. "What about him?" "He made choices today that I wouldn't have made, that I couldn't have made." He paused. "But he was the one inside it. And he stayed inside it for 14 months for the same reason a soldier holds a position. Because the alternative was leaving the field to people who shouldn't have it." Emily thought about Ruiz. She would think about Ruiz for a long time. She already knew this. "What do we do about the choices that can't be undone?" she asked. Holloway was quiet. The helicopter sound reached them before he answered. The distant percussion of rotor blades coming from the north, still too far to see. "You document what happened," he said finally. "You carry it accurately. You don't let the institution turn it into something it wasn't." He looked at her with the level directness that she had learned, over the past day, meant he was saying the truest version of what he knew. "And you keep doing the work. Because the work doesn't stop because a particular day was hard. It doesn't stop because the people giving orders aren't always the people who deserve to give them." A pause. "It stops when you stop, so you don't stop." The helicopter came over the highway, dropping toward the checkpoint's landing zone. Holloway picked up his kit with his bandaged hands and started walking. Emily picked up hers and walked beside him. The UH-60 banked north at 800 feet, and through the scratched plexiglass window, Emily watched Cuervo Junction fall away below. It looked smaller from altitude, contained, almost orderly, the grid of streets, the checkpoint at the southern edge, the grain elevator standing in the morning light with its scorched roof detail visible as a small dark mark if you knew where to look. The highway bridge intact, spanning the dry wash, the water tower, the Paloma Hotel, its 11 stories catching the early sun, its roof a rectangle of concrete and shadow from which, if you were looking very carefully at the right angle, you could see the northwest parapet where she'd spent 16 hours. Nobody looking at this from above would know what it had been yesterday. The checkpoint was running. The bridge was standing. The people who remained in Cuervo Junction were going about the compressed, cautious version of ordinary life that people lived in contested border zones. And they were alive to do it, and none of them knew how close that had been. She thought about Phase 3, unmarked on an operational timeline in a folder that no longer existed but had existed, and had described with bureaucratic precision the deaths of people who had not died. She thought about Reyes, wherever Reyes was now, and she suspected she would not know where Reyes was for a long time, if ever. He was carrying 14 months of documentation towards something she couldn't fully see yet, a reckoning that might take a year, or might take 5 years, or might be managed and contained by the people who had built the operation and still held the institutional authority to manage things. She didn't know which. She knew what she had, a field notebook, Holloway's testimony, and a clear observation record of a day in which the official account and the observable facts had diverged at every significant junction. She knew that somewhere Garza's original report existed in a copy that Regional Command Southwest hadn't been able to reach. She knew that the bridge was standing. She knew what soldiers were supposed to do. Holloway was asleep in the seat beside her, or performing sleep with the comprehensive commitment of a man who had decided that the body's claims took precedence over everything else for the next 45 minutes. His hands were folded in his lap, the medical tape clean against the early light. His face was completely still. She looked at him and felt something that wasn't quite gratitude and wasn't quite the weight of a debt. It was the feeling of having been shown something important by someone who didn't have to show it. You've seen things today that would have gone past most people. He'd said that in the middle of all of it, when there wasn't time for it, and she had filed it away and was only now taking it out and understanding it properly. He hadn't been complimenting her. He'd been telling her something about what the work required, about what it meant to see clearly when the environment had been designed to prevent clear seeing, about the specific responsibility that came with being the person who understood what they were looking at. She pulled out her notebook, found a fresh page, began writing. Not the field log. That was complete, documented, dated, and signed. Something else. The version that would be for her, the one that went underneath the official record into the place where soldiers kept the things that the official record didn't have room for. She wrote about the truck driver whose name she didn't know. She wrote about Ruiz. She wrote about the pigeons on the Paloma's east face and the broken dust line on the parapet and what it had meant to understand that she was not alone on that roof. She wrote, "The truth is not always what the record says. The record is what someone decided to write down. The truth is what you saw." The helicopter leveled off at cruise altitude, and the desert spread out below. Vast, sun-bleached, crossed by highways and dry riverbeds, and the kind of distances that made human activity look provisional. A place where things happened in the gaps between visibility and were seen or not seen, depending on whether someone with the right angle and the right patience was paying attention. She loaded the next page of her notebook and kept writing. Because in the gaps was where the real war was fought. Not the war of orders and official records and command assessments that would be filed and archived and cited by people who hadn't been on the ground. The other one. The one that happened when no one was watching, except when someone was.